In the early years of the 1930s, Berlin stood at a crossroads of history. It was a city alive with contradiction. On the surface, Berlin was modern, energetic, and culturally fearless. Beneath that energy, however, powerful political forces were reshaping daily life in ways that would soon affect the entire world. Economic hardship, social tension, and political extremism collided in the streets, cafes, theaters, and government buildings of the German capital. What followed was not an overnight transformation, but a steady and deliberate remaking of a city and its people. Before authoritarian rule took hold, Berlin was one of Europe's most progressive urban centers. Artists, writers, filmmakers, and architects from across the continent were drawn to its openness and creative freedom. Nightlife thrived, intellectual debate was common, and experimental ideas were welcomed rather than feared. Architecture reflected this forward-looking spirit. The city embraced clean lines, practical design, and modern materials. The Bauhaus philosophy left a strong imprint on Berlin, emphasizing function over decoration and promoting a belief that design could improve everyday life. Housing projects, schools, and public buildings expressed optimism about the future and confidence in progress. At the same time, Germany was struggling with the aftermath of World War I and the economic devastation of the Great Depression. Unemployment rose sharply, public trust in democratic institutions weakened, and anger simmered beneath the surface. These conditions created fertile ground for radical political movements. Among them was the Nazi Party, which promised national revival, order, and restored pride. In 1933, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, the party seized control of the government and began dismantling democratic structures almost immediately. Once in power, the new regime moved quickly to reshape Berlin into a symbol of its ideology. Freedom of expression was crushed. Political opponents were silenced, arrested, or forced into exile. Independent newspapers disappeared, replaced by state-controlled media that echoed official narratives. Public spaces that once hosted debate and creativity became stages for rallies, marches, and carefully choreographed displays of loyalty. The city was no longer meant to represent diversity or innovation. It was redesigned to project strength, obedience, and permanence. Architecture became one of the regime's most visible tools. Modernist ideas were rejected as un-German, and many Bauhaus-influenced architects were pushed out of their professions. In their place rose massive stone structures meant to intimidate and inspire awe. Buildings were designed to look eternal, overwhelming the individual and reinforcing the authority of the state. One of the most prominent symbols of this shift was the Reich Chancellery, which embodied the regime's obsession with scale, symmetry, and power. These projects were not simply functional. They were ideological statements carved into the city itself. As Berlin's appearance changed, so did the lives of its residents. Jewish citizens, who had long been an integral part of the city's cultural, economic, and intellectual life, became targets of systematic discrimination. Laws stripped them of civil rights, excluded them from professions, and isolated them socially. Jewish businesses were boycotted, vandalized, and eventually destroyed. Many families fled the country if they could. Others went into hiding, hoping the violence would pass. It did not. The attacks of 1938 marked a brutal escalation, signaling that persecution had moved from policy to open violence. Propaganda played a central role in maintaining control. Nowhere was this more visible than during the 1936 Summer Olympics, hosted in the city. To the outside world, Berlin was presented as peaceful, modern, and welcoming. Anti-Semitic signs were temporarily removed, and foreign visitors were carefully guided through a curated version of German life. The games were staged in monumental venues, including the Olympic Stadium, designed to impress and persuade. Behind the spectacle, repression continued uninterrupted, hidden from international cameras. By the late 1930s, Berlin had been fundamentally transformed. What was once a cosmopolitan capital of ideas had become a tightly controlled center of authoritarian rule. Fear replaced openness. Uniformity replaced creativity. Surveillance and loyalty tests became part of everyday life. Children were educated to serve the state, not to question it. Art existed only to glorify power. Architecture existed only to dominate the human scale. The city itself became a tool, reinforcing ideology through stone, ceremony, and silence. When war broke out in 1939, Berlin was already deeply shaped by years of indoctrination and control. The conflict would soon bring physical destruction to match the moral and cultural damage already done. Bombings, shortages, and loss followed, turning grand avenues into ruins and monuments into reminders of hubris. Yet the story of Berlin in the 1930s is not only one of collapse. It is also a warning. It shows how quickly a vibrant society can be reshaped when fear, propaganda, and unchecked power take hold. Berlin's experience during this decade remains one of the most striking examples of how cities reflect the values imposed upon them. In just a few years, architecture, culture, and daily life were transformed to serve an ideology built on exclusion and control. Understanding this transformation is essential, not only to remember the past, but to recognize how fragile openness and freedom can be when they are taken for granted.